You were taught that poverty is an accident, a bad break, a missing scholarship, a missing father, a missing chance. That is the most successful lie in human history, and you have been repeating it to yourself every single night before you fall asleep, exhausted from a job that will never make you free. Here is the truth. No professor, no pastor, and no self-help author will ever say to your face, poverty is not an accident, it is an architecture. Somewhere, centuries ago, a small number of men worked out exactly which beliefs keep a population compliant, hard-working, and permanently behind, and then they made sure those beliefs were taught in every school, praised in every church, and printed on every motivational poster you have ever scrolled past at 2 in the morning. Right now, tonight, you are following at least 3 of those beliefs without knowing it. One of them is the exact reason your bank account looks the way it does. And in the next few minutes, a 500-year-old Florentine advisor to princes is going to hand you the map that the wealthy have used since the Medici. Not because he cared about you, but because he never lied about what power actually requires. If you close this video now, you go back to the version of you that thinks discipline alone will save you. Stay, and you will never see money, work, or your own choices the same way again. His name was Niccolò Machiavelli, and history remembers him as a monster for one reason only. He refused to describe the world as it should be, and instead described it exactly as it is. Everyone who has ever accumulated real generational power has quietly followed his logic. Everyone who has ever stayed poor has been taught to despise it. By the end of this film, you will understand 10 of his coldest, most uncomfortable observations about money, status, and human nature, and exactly how the system uses your own virtue against you. This is not motivation. This is the blueprint they hoped you would never read. Chapter 1. Picture a woman working her second consecutive double shift, proud that she has never once called in sick in 4 years. She tells herself this is character. Her employer tells her this is character. What no one tells her is that her reliability has a market price, and she has agreed to sell it at a permanent discount because refusing to would feel, to her, like a betrayal of who she is. Machiavelli understood something brutal here. A prince who is loved but not feared will be exploited by everyone around him, and a person who has built their entire identity around being the reliable one, the hard worker, the good employee, has handed every future negotiation to whoever is paying them. Your identity became your leash, and you tied the knot yourself. Look at the Medici bankers of Florence. They did not become the wealthiest family in Europe by being the most virtuous. They became wealthy by understanding precisely when loyalty was profitable and when it was a liability, and they never let sentiment override that calculation twice. Compare that to the artisan class of the same century, skilled, proud, devoted to their guilds, and permanently dependent on the very families who set the price of their labor. The 1% were not smarter with their hands, they were colder with their identity. If you have ever felt guilty asking for a raise, felt disloyal considering another offer, or stayed in a situation that was quietly bleeding you because leaving wasn't who you are, that guilt was not morality. It was a leash, fitted so early in your life that it now feels like your own skin. Tonight, write down one obligation you fulfill purely because of who you believe yourself to be, not because it serves you. That single sentence is the first crack in the wall. But identity is only the first trap. The second one is far more comfortable and far more expensive. Lessons 2. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that only the hardest workers know, the exhaustion of a person who has done everything right and is still, somehow, no closer to free. Society calls this paying your dues. Machiavelli would have called it something else, a virtue weaponized against the person practicing it. He wrote that a ruler must appear virtuous but never be enslaved by virtue itself, because virtue without leverage is simply obedience with better public relations. Consider Rome's early plebeians who built an empire's roads, aqueducts and armies with their own backs, while patrician families accumulated the land. Those very roads increased in value. The plebeians were not lazy. They were, if anything, the hardest working population in the ancient world. Their labor was never the missing variable. Leverage was. The patricians owned the systems that turned effort into compounding wealth. The plebeians only owned the effort itself. This is the moment to be honest with yourself. Effort has never been the scarce resource. Everyone around you is capable of effort. What is scarce is ownership of your time, your intellectual property, your negotiating position, your access to capital. If you have spent a decade being praised for how hard you work, and yet your net worth has barely moved, the system did not fail to notice your effort. It succeeded in extracting it. The practical leverage here is uncomfortable but simple. Stop trading additional hours for additional praise and start asking what you actually own at the end of each project: equity, IP, a client relationship, a skill no one else in the room has. Ownership is the only kind of work that compounds while you sleep. But even ownership can be stolen quietly by rules you never agreed to and were never meant to question. Lessons 3. Every child is handed the same sentence before they can even read. Follow the rules and you will be safe. No one mentions that the rules were not written by people trying to keep you safe. They were written by people trying to keep themselves in power, and safety was simply the story that made compliance feel noble. Machiavelli's most infamous line is often paraphrased as, "The ends justify the means," but his real argument was colder still. The rules that bind the many are rarely the rules that bind the few who wrote them. Look at the aristocracy of pre-revolutionary France. Sumptuary laws dictated exactly what fabric, what color, what jewelry the merchant class was permitted to wear. Rules enforced with real legal teeth against everyone except the nobility who invented them. The message was never subtle. Order is for those who might rise, not for those who already have. The same architecture exists today in far quieter language. Non-compete clauses, credit terms, tax codes, thousands of pages long, that only those who can afford the right accountant ever fully exploit. The 99% read the rulebook and conclude it describes the world. The 1% read the same rulebook and understand it describes only what the world requires them to appear to follow. That is not a difference in intelligence. It is a difference in whether you were raised to question authorship. You do not need to become dishonest to survive this. You need to stop assuming every rule in your life was designed with your interests in mind. Before your next major financial decision, ask one brutal question. Who wrote this rule, and what did they gain by making me believe it was permanent? Some rules are real, far fewer than you were taught. Once you start questioning who wrote the rules, you will notice something even more unsettling: who is allowed to keep silent and who is punished for it. Lessons 4. Open honesty is sold to the poor as a virtue and practiced by the wealthy only as a strategy. Machiavelli warned that a prince who reveals every intention hands his enemies the exact tools to defeat him, and yet ordinary people are taught from childhood that oversharing their plans, their salary, their next move is simply being genuine, and permanently outmaneuvered. The Rothschild banking network built its early fortune not on secrecy in the criminal sense, but on informational asymmetry used with surgical precision, knowing outcomes, market movements and political developments before the public did, and positioning capital accordingly while everyone else waited for the newspaper. That single edge, repeated across a generation, became a dynasty. Compare that to a household today that announces every raise, every bonus, every purchase on social media the moment it happens, broadcasting their financial position to landlords, employers, and relatives who will each, consciously or not, price that information into how they treat you. The uncomfortable archetype contrast is this. The poor treat information as a way to connect. The wealthy treat information as a resource to be deployed only when it produces leverage. Neither is more honest as a human being, but only one of them protects their position while gathering the intelligence to improve it. Tonight, practice one form of strategic silence. The next time you receive good financial news, tell no one for 72 hours. Notice how uncomfortable that restraint feels. That discomfort is the exact muscle that was never trained in you, and it is the same muscle every negotiator, investor, and strategist in history has relied on. Silence protects position. But debt, used wrong, destroys it, and used right, it becomes the very tool your enemies use against you. Lessons 5. You were taught that debt is dangerous, and for you, as currently positioned, it usually is. What you were never taught is why the same instrument that ruins one household quietly compounds another family's fortune for 100 years. Machiavelli observed that fortune favors those who adapt the tool to the moment rather than treating any tool as inherently good or evil, and no tool proves that colder than borrowed capital. The medieval Fugger banking family financed the Habsburg Emperor's wars using precisely structured debt, and in exchange received mining rights across an empire that made them wealthier than most kings. The debt did not enslave the Fuggers. It was leveraged, asset-backed, and aimed directly at acquiring appreciating power. Contrast that with the ordinary borrower of any century, taking on debt for a depreciating asset or a lifestyle expense, paying interest that flows upward into someone else's compounding machine. This is the archetype split laid bare. The poor borrow to consume. The wealthy borrow to acquire what generates more than the interest costs. Same instrument, opposite destinies. You were never warned about debt's danger out of protection. You were warned in a way that discouraged you from ever learning to use it as a weapon of acquisition instead of a leash of consumption. Before you borrow again for anything, ask a single Machiavellian question. Will this debt purchase something that pays me back more than it costs, or something that simply feels good tonight? That one distinction has separated dynasties from debt spirals for 600 years, and once capital starts working correctly, you'll discover the deepest secret of all, that money was never really the point. Perception was. Lesson 6. A prince, Machiavelli wrote, need not actually possess every virtue. He must only be seen to possess them, because the crowd judges by appearance and outcome, almost never by truth. This single sentence explains more about modern wealth than any economics textbook. Perceived value moves faster than real value, and the person who understands this controls rooms that pure competence alone will never enter. Study the Renaissance courts of Italy, where a merchant family's commissioned art, palazzo facade, and public patronage mattered as much to their credit and marriages as their actual ledgers, because reputation itself functioned as collateral. The Medici did not merely have money, they curated the visible signals of permanence and taste that made lenders, popes, and rival families extend trust before verifying substance. Compare that to the brilliant, competent person today who underdresses for the negotiation, undersells the pitch, and is quietly passed over for someone with half their skill and twice their polish. This is not a call to become fake. It is a demand that you stop confusing humility with invisibility. The 99% believe competence should speak for itself. The 1% understand that competence, which is never packaged, framed, and presented, is competence the market will simply never price correctly. Tonight, examine one place where your actual value and your perceived value have drifted apart. An achievement you never mentioned, a skill you undersell, a room you enter smaller than you actually are. Close that gap by 10% this week. Perception is not vanity. It is unpriced inventory. But perception without restraint curdles into something else, a generosity so unguarded it becomes the very weapon used to drain you. Lessons 7. Machiavelli's most misquoted warning is that it is safer to be feared than loved if you cannot be both, and the part everyone forgets is why. Love, he argued, is maintained by a bond of gratitude that self-interest can shatter at any convenient moment. A foundation resting entirely on other people's goodwill is a foundation you do not control. Generosity extended without any structure of reciprocity or protection is not virtue, it is exposure. The philanthropic patrons of the Gilded Age understood this coldly. Carnegie gave away hundreds of millions, yes, but strategically through libraries and institutions that carried his name, extended his influence for a century, and were structured to outlast any single beneficiary's gratitude or resentment. Compare that to the ordinary generous person lending money to family with no agreement, covering a friend's expenses with no boundary, mistaking the discomfort of saying no for the absence of love. One version of generosity builds a legacy. The other quietly funds someone else's present at the cost of your own future. This is the realization that stings most. Your kindness has likely been priced by people who love you far less than you assume, and they know exactly how far they can extend it before you finally say no. That is not cynicism. That is Machiavelli's cold mathematics of loyalty applied to your own family group chat. The practical leverage is simple and unromantic. Give with structure, not with guilt. A boundary, a repayment date, a stated limit. None of it makes you less generous. It makes your generosity survive contact with people who will otherwise treat your open hand as a permanent account. And once your generosity is protected, the next trap waiting is the oldest one of all, the way you have been taught to spend the only truly finite resource you own. Lessons 8. You have been taught to sell your time for money and call it a job, a career, a life plan. You were never taught that the wealthy spend their entire strategy trying to buy your time back from you at the lowest possible price, then resell the output of that time at the highest possible margin. Machiavelli's princes understood force and money as convertible resources, and time, more than either, is the resource that never regenerates once spent. The industrial barons of the 19th century did not personally work harder hours than the workers in their factories. They purchased other people's hours in bulk at a fixed low price and multiplied the output through machinery and scale that the individual laborer could never access alone. The worker sold 8, 10, 12 hours a day and received a wage. The owner purchased 10,000 of those same hours simultaneously and captured the compounding difference. Neither man necessarily worked harder. One owned the multiplier, the other was the multiplier. This is the identity shift that should genuinely disturb you. Every hour you trade directly for a fixed wage, with no ownership of the output, is an hour someone else is quietly multiplying without you. The poor experience time linearly, one paid hour after another. The wealthy experience time as a portfolio to be leveraged, automated, or purchased from others at scale. Tonight, identify 1 hour of your week you could convert from linear labor into something that compounds, a skill packaged once and sold repeatedly, a system built once and run forever, a piece of content recorded once and watched by thousands. That single conversion is the beginning of buying your own time back. But none of this, not ownership, not silence, not perception, not protected time, will save you if you remain afraid of the one trait every ruthless survivor in history was forced to develop. Lessons 9. Here is the sentence that will make you flinch. Your discomfort with being ruthless has cost you more money than any recession ever will. Machiavelli never argued that cruelty was good. He argued that the refusal to ever act decisively, to ever disappoint someone, to ever choose your own position over another person's comfort, produces a kind of chronic weakness that predators, financial, professional, and personal, can smell from across a room. Cesare Borgia's brutal, decisive consolidation of the Romagna is remembered as savage, but Machiavelli's actual observation was narrower and colder, decisive. Early severity prevented years of prolonged suffering caused by hesitation. Compare that to any modern professional who avoids the difficult conversation, the necessary layoff, the uncomfortable negotiation, the client who must be fired, and watches the slow bleed of that avoidance cost them far more over years than one sharp, uncomfortable decision ever would have. The uncomfortable truth is this: the 99% avoid short-term conflict and absorb long-term damage. The 1% absorb short-term conflict and avoid long-term damage. Your entire nervous system has likely been trained to prioritize the first kind of comfort at the exact moment your finances required the second kind of courage. Tonight, name the one decisive, uncomfortable financial or professional conversation you have been postponing for months. Machiavelli's leverage here is brutally simple. Have it this week, cleanly and without cruelty, but without further delay. Every day of avoidance is compounding interest paid to your own fear. There is one final principle beneath all 9 of these, the one that determines whether anything you have just learned outlives you at all. Lessons 10. The poor think in paychecks. The middle class thinks in years. The truly wealthy think in generations, and that single difference in time horizon is the deepest, most brutal lesson Machiavelli ever encoded into The Prince. That a ruler's every decision must be evaluated not by its immediate comfort, but by whether it strengthens the position of whoever inherits the throne after him. The great banking and land dynasties of Europe did not simply accumulate wealth. They built structures, trusts, marriages, institutions, education systems for their heirs, explicitly designed to outlive the individual who created them. A single fortune, however large, dies with poor planning. A system, once built correctly, compounds for centuries, regardless of any one person's mistakes. Compare that to the ordinary household that plans meticulously for next month's bills and almost never for what happens to their knowledge, assets, and mindset 40 years after they are gone. This is the final identity shift, and it is the heaviest one. Everything you have learned tonight about identity, effort, rules, silence, debt, perception, generosity, time, and decisiveness means nothing if it dies with you out of the same short-term thinking that kept your ancestors poor. You are not just trying to escape poverty for yourself. You are deciding right now whether the pattern ends with you or continues quietly into whoever comes after you. Every failure you have ever blamed on bad luck, laziness, or a missing opportunity now has a different name. It was never a personal defect. It was a system, 500 years old, cold, deliberate, and indifferent to your suffering, running exactly as designed on a population taught to mistake obedience for virtue. Machiavelli did not build that system. He simply refused to lie to you about it, the way everyone else in your life with the best of intentions has lied to you your entire time on this earth. You now know that your identity can be a leash. That effort without ownership is extraction. That rules are written by the few and enforced on the many. That silence is leverage. That debt is a weapon pointed in whichever direction you aim it. That perception is unpriced inventory. That unstructured generosity is exposure. That time is the only currency that never regenerates. That avoided conflict compounds into greater damage, and that everything you build must be built to outlive you, or it was never truly built at all. None of this requires you to become cruel. It requires you to stop being unconsciously obedient to a story that was never designed to make you free. The version of you that watched this entire film to the end is no longer permitted the comfort of blaming luck. You know too much now to go back to sleep. Subscribe if you are ready to stop studying the cage and start studying the architects who built it. Because next time we go deeper into the exact psychological weapons the powerful have used since Rome, and I promise you, it gets far darker than money.